Hello and Anine. Thank you for joining with people from across Turtle Island today to reflect on the importance of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in the context of a just recovery. My name is Leah Watkis. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the chair of the Joint Ecological Ministry. I would like to thank the Canadian Religious Conference for collaborating with GEM, Joint Ecological Ministry, in organizing today's event. We stand on Turtle Island, which has been home to many nations since time immemorial. I'm speaking to you from Tekaronto, which is the land of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. These and other nations of Turtle Island were irrevocably harmed by the arrival of European settlers who have systematically tried to destroy and erase them. In our ongoing journey towards reconciliation, GEM members are relearning the history of this country and this land, critically examining the ways they have benefited from systemic racism and the role the Catholic Church has played in those systems of oppression. GEM is committed to redressing these harms, and we are striving to follow the directions of Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si, to engage in dialogue, to show special care for Indigenous communities and teachings, and to dismantle the oppressive structures that fracture our relationships with God, creation, and neighbor. We hope that this event will play a role in this ongoing and very important work. We invite you now to use the chat box to share with us what territory you are in and one thing that you are doing to work towards reconciliation with the First Peoples of this land. Today's gathering will include learning from our guest speaker, Dr. Niigaan Sinclair, followed by a question and answer period. We plan to finish this event at 3:45 p.m. Eastern Time. Our moderators for today are Sister Margot Ritchie and Sister Joan Atkinson from the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada, based in London. They will be introducing our guest speaker shortly, but before we begin, we are asking Sister Christine Gable to lead us in prayer. Sister Christine, over to you.
Thank you. Barca, there you go, thank you. As we begin, let us pay attention to our breathing. Let us be relaxed in our body and our mind. Let us return to ourselves and become holy ourselves. Let us be aware of the source of being common to us all and to all living things. Evoking the presence of the great compassion, let us fill our hearts with our own compassion towards ourselves and toward all living things. Let us pray that all living beings realize that they are brothers and sisters, all nourished from the same source of life. Let us pray that we ourselves cease to be the cause of suffering to each other. Let us plead with ourselves to live in a way that will not deprive other beings of air, water, food, shelter, or the chance to live. With humility, with awareness of the existence of life, and of the sufferings that are going on around us, let us pray for the establishment of peace in our hearts and on earth. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Christine. Sisters Margot and Joan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Leah and Christine. Well, I want to begin by just saying a few words about GEM today, Joint Ecological Ministry, which is a collaboration of religious communities and partners using their resources to promote caring for creation and living within planetary limits. We're relatively new, 2015, and our aim is to encourage Catholic communities' leadership to address the climate emergency by providing useful information and tools to facilitate their decisions. Some of the topics of discussion that we've had included divestment from fossil fuels, the Catholic calling in addressing the climate emergency, among other subjects. And just last year, our gathering spoke about the decolonization within the context of climate change. Both keynote speakers, Sylvia McAdam and Dr. Deborah McGregor, inspired a critical discussion on the importance of the Indigenous systems of knowledge in addressing the climate crisis and the long road ahead of us in achieving a true reconciliation. And now I'd like to introduce Niigaan. Now, before the call, Niigaan said all I was to say was that he's a nice guy, and perhaps that we would give more attention to his new cat, Nibby, that he's had for just a few months, Nibby meaning water. But I think I will say a couple of things about you, Niigaan. Niigaan Sinclair is Anishinaabe and an associate professor at the University of Manitoba. He is an award-winning writer, editor, and activist, and the little bit of research I did, who fiercely believes in the power of local newspapers to keep people accountable and connected. Besides describing himself as a recovering high school teacher, he was named one of Monocle magazine's Canada's top 20 most influential people, and one of the CBC's Manitoba's top 40 under 40. He is a regular commentator on Indigenous issues on CTV, CBC, and APTN, and his written work can be found in a variety of newspapers like the Globe and Mail. So we're very happy to have you with us. We feel quite honored.
Okay, unmute myself. So bonjour everybody. Bonjour ndema magaraduk. Niigaan webedam nadisha kostnam agoshendo dem. Imen wendam omayayin. Aganabach bungi gisana agujing zukapan agujing bibun agujing. It's a pleasure to be here to acknowledge our relatives outside. Bonjour numishomasak nakomasak mijana gijik nimichi nibekwe. It's nice to speak the language of my territory, Treaty 1 territory, and yeah, it's nice to see everyone. I think there's about 100 people or so on the chat, and I'm not sure where else, but wherever you're coming from, I can see you all put it in the chat, so I have that up on my screen. Bonjour, particularly to all my relatives who are sitting in Anishinaabe communities, who are you know, part of our communities as well in our nation. I also want to say greetings to those who are in the rancorous environment of what's happening just to the south of us. I can appreciate, I'm going to speak a little bit about that. I think I've been asked to speak for about 45 minutes about you know, ecology and Indigenous traditions, Indigenous activism as well. So I'll be speaking about some of that stuff. But particularly, maybe I'll just switch over now and start sharing my screen. So I hope you can all see my screen here. Here we go. I can't see anybody, so I'm just assuming you'll stop me if there's any errors or if there's any problems like that. But so this is the things that I do in the community, and different things that I'm involved in. And of course, I'm I'm a professor, and I'm also a writer, and I do a number of other things. You heard about my bio just a minute ago. But what I've been telling people is there is no ability to be ignorant any longer on anything Indigenous. And a good example would be in the work that I do, I'm frequently in different environments across the globe. So in 1 week, for example, this is a picture of me at The Hague in the Netherlands, speaking at the World Court with lawyers and judges from across the world about Indigenous land issues, Indigenous issues, rights, Indigenous rights issues, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And then that same week, I could be involved in a downtown discussion with grassroots Indigenous peoples living mostly in poverty, over-policed, over-incarcerated, dealing with issues that are frontline issues. And I also volunteer in the downtown core area of Winnipeg here with a group called the Mama Bear Clan. So we provide community health services, food, cleanup. We also offer spiritual assistance for those in the downtown core. We're not a mission project. What we are is we offer a smudge, and we offer a listening ear, and we offer a supportive person to the approximately 90% of the homeless population in Winnipeg, which is Indigenous. And so we just offer a friendly ear, kindness for the most part. And so that's the kind of competency that you're going to be required to have. If you cannot speak about Indigenous issues, frankly, there are no environments that you can go any further where you can be ignorant. The Donald Trumps of the world, frankly, 35% of Canada, which likes to put its head in the sand and pretend that Indigenous rights don't exist, or don't want to have a conversation with Indigenous issues surrounding historical use and occupancy of territory, Indigenous title. Frankly, that's reducing every year, and that's going to be gone at some point into the future. Frankly, if you don't know how to have those conversations, you're more and more becoming redundant, archaic, and frankly, the world is moving too fast for you. The issue is that there is more and more of what we'll call an Indigenous professional leadership group, coterie, a critical mass of Indigenous peoples. And this is embodied in my graduating class at the University of British Columbia. The University of British Columbia had the most aggressive agenda when it came to the creation of Indigenous PhDs. In 2005, they decided that they would make a 5-year commitment to make 500 Indigenous PhDs in 5 years, and they exceeded that in 3, even though everybody told them that would be impossible. There wasn't enough Indigenous peoples committed to graduate programs. And now, who are all those people? They're professors, doctors, lawyers, psychologists, tribal leaders, MLAs, MPs. These are people who are now thoroughly in the middle class mainstream projects within the country, and the Indigenous critical mass of people in that category who are entering into the public and private sector is faster than any other community in the country. Now, of course, at the same time, I'm also a parent. And so I can appreciate those when we're talking about parenting and we're talking about remembering that we are people from communities and from families. And so trying to balance all of that is sometimes complex and complicated, but it's an important part of our lives that we cannot separate. For Indigenous peoples, we don't separate our personal and our professional life. It is all just one life. It's just who we are, who we fundamentally are. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the ways that what we're here to do today, which is to talk really about gift giving. So I want to just speak a little bit about what it means to give a gift. So when we start in Anishinaabe worlds, and this is the Anishinaabe Nation right here. So if you're part of the Anishinaabe Nation, you're basically part of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, North Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, parts even of Illinois and Indiana, and then a tiny little bit part of Quebec as well. And if you're part of any of those parts, and including New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio as well, which is where Indigenous Anishinaabe people also traditionally used occupied territory. In fact, our traditional homelands are out near Maine and Nova Scotia. You are sharing territories with Anishinaabe, and that means my people, my nation, one of the biggest nations in North America, our Turtle Island. And what it means is that you're going to have to know how to function in this nation. The most important function in which you'll understand is you'll be witnessing a tobacco offering. A tobacco offering is what we do at the beginning. And a tobacco offering isn't just something that's done ornamentally or something simply or something that's done as sort of a whatever thing. A tobacco offering is law. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. A tobacco offering, when you offer somebody a gift of tobacco, what you're offering is the time that you have committed to the relationship. Now, what that means is The word for tobacco means asema, which means instant. So, or it comes from the ashema, the Anishinaabe word ashema, which means instant. So the word ashema, instant, derives into the word asema, which is the word we use for tobacco. And what tobacco does is it instantly creates a relationship. When you offer it, it must be chosen to be accepted. You cannot just throw it at somebody and expect that to be accepted. That's a different word that we use. We call it bagadinan, which is that you've tossed away. When you bagadinan, you are offering a gift to be picked up by someone. When that is picked up, then whatever is agreed upon according to the tobacco, that's why you have to speak to that tobacco when you offer it to somebody, is thus being agreed upon. So maybe it might be to offer to help somebody understand something, or make a big decision, or give your daughter a name, for example. So when somebody offers you that asema, it's a big deal, because here's what it represents. Now, tobacco is very hard to grow. As you can see here, the seeds are very small. They're very complex. It's very difficult to grow tobacco, particularly here in Treaty 1 territory. A little bit easier in one of the homes of tobacco, which is Southern Ontario. In the Wendat territory down there, they're considered for us amongst Anishinaabe, one of the tobacco carriers, because they were master tobacco growers. And so what they were able to do is they were able to use the growing season in its fullest form, but it takes about 6 months to do that. So if you want to grow tobacco today, you got to need a heating lamp. You got to be able to really commit to that. You don't go for drinks on a Friday with your buddies. You don't go watch Netflix. You don't take the kids to band practice or hockey practice or whatever it might be. You commit to tobacco. Now, after 6 months, you put 100 hours into that tobacco, and then it grows to this size. That means time away from your kids, time away from other things that you've done, time away from Netflix and from your friends and from your kids. Your blood, your sweat, your tears have gone into that tobacco. 100 hours of your time has gone into that tiny little pinch, because once you take the leaves off, dry it for a bit longer, there's some more time, then you crinkle it and make the tiniest little pinch in your hand. And then I want you to imagine this thing you've put 100 hours into, all your blood, your sweat, your time away from your kids, your blood, your sweat, your energy, all of your blood, your sweat, your tears, everything, and you give it away. Now, if that isn't a remarkable gift, I don't know what is. What it tells you is that you have brought that time to that relationship, and you've indicated to the person that you're gifting that you are committed to that relationship, because imagine the amount of commitment that it takes for anyone to put 100 hours into another person, into a non-human being for that matter. Imagine how much better off this world would be if we all put 100 hours into our ties and our connections and our stories and our relationships with other people. If we put 100 hours of time into each relationship that we had with not just human beings, but non-human beings, we would be pretty committed, we would be pretty embedded, we would also be pretty reliant and responsible and ethical when it came to dealing with people around us. Now, unfortunately, we live in a world in which most oftentimes we're encouraged to have less time with people, but tobacco reminds us of the value of a relationship, the value of time when it comes to build that relationship. That's why when we accept tobacco, we say, miigwech. Miigwech does not mean thank you. It comes from the verb miigwe, which means I will give. So when somebody says miigwech to you in Anishinaabe nationhood, which as you can see is a huge nation, what they're saying is I will give it on, or I will give it back, but I will do something with it. So this tobacco that you have offered, I will thus do something with it. And what you hope is the 100 hours you put into the tobacco that you give, that person will give 100 hours back to you. That's what you hope. Just like at a feast, right? You hope that everybody comes to the feast and brings wonderful gifts that they've put their time and their energy into, a potluck. You don't hope that everybody brings chips, because if everybody brings chips that they stopped at Sev along the way, then that's going to be one terrible potluck. Where what you hope is that when people put time into each other, we have a bountiful, healthy, productive group in which we are all better off as having put time into each other. We're all better off. We don't get diabetes, we don't get sick, we don't get a bunch of over salt intake if we all just brought chips to the potluck. My point of saying it is, the more that we understand about tobacco and gifts, the more that you will understand what Indigenous peoples are trying to do with this world around us. Now, I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the world that we live in, but I don't want to traumatize you with this next slide. So I just want you to take a breath. Take a breath. Don't get traumatized. Okay. Hope that didn't traumatize you at all. As you can see here, we live in a world right now where individualism, property, particularly ownership of individuals, the 1%, corporate entities, and the use of land and territory has been commercialized to the point where people recognize corporate logos before they recognize national flags, for example. They recognize corporate logos before they understand health labels. They know corporate logos before they even understand the own insignias, clans, images of their family, even family pictures. I mean, that's how deeply entrenched this world has become, based in notions of property, ownership, capitalism, neoliberalism. And the bottom line of it is that this is just increasing. And there's a really great video. If you go to my Twitter feed, there's a really great video that was posted during this past few days. And it's really great by a commentary guy. I believe his name is Ernie Hudson, I think his name is. And he reminds us that Donald Trump is not the problem. Donald Trump is just the symptom. Donald Trump is the symptom of what America is and always has been, which is that America is based in a notion of individual freedom, which has always been based in an illusion of goodness. And that illusion of goodness has always been built off the backs of brown people. Has been always about exploiting Native people, using Black Americans for labor, and then exploiting nowadays the Latino class. And all of that is tied up in the American dream, as if the American dream is somehow based in people earning, when it's really about people violently exploiting the land, destroying the people within it, and the relationships particularly, and then on top of that, using and continuing to maintain poverty over those communities so they have a constant and continual need to serve the upper class. Love that video. I think it's a really important video for us to talk about, but then something really remarkable every once in a while begins to happen. And I want to just show you a column that I wrote. This is a column that I wrote just before the election on Tuesday. I wrote it in the morning of actually wrote it the day before the election. I noticed something when I was looking at the American election this time around, and I am not a person who is a strong advocate for racialized people to participate in the systems that oppress and marginalize and destroy us. However, I think that I don't judge people who do decide to vote, who decide to participate in systems. I mean, I'm a professor at a university, so there probably is no more exploitative entity in the world than universities when it comes to Indigenous communities. So obviously, I do believe that institutions have some role to play in the change. So one of the things that I've noticed is that everyone kept talking about swing states. You know, everyone kept talking about this election as swing states. And if you look to see what I said here, I'll just highlight it for you. To get to 270 electoral college votes, basically Biden or Trump had to win Arizona, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. They had to win one of those five, probably a mixture or majority of those five. And of course, what we've seen at the end of the day is that Biden has won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and probably Arizona, although that's still up in the air. I just checked my phone, although maybe, who knows? Things seem to be coming in every half an hour or so, so I haven't checked for about an hour. But now, what's the thing that unifies all of those states? Well, it is that Native American voters make up 2 to 5% of every single one of those swing states. Unlike virtually other states across, even the states that are so-called most known for Native people, like North and South Dakota, they're under 2%. The only other state that even comes close is like Oklahoma. But even Oklahoma has a small percentage of Indigenous peoples comparatively with other communities. In fact, most of the communities that have majorities are higher than 2 to 5% are places like New Mexico, where leans Democrat. So what does that tell you? Native people tend to more often vote Democrat. Not everybody, of course. I would say that Indians in Oklahoma and Texas tend to vote Republican, mostly do the Army thing down there. But particularly in those swing states, Native people are voting overwhelmingly Democrat. Now, in each one of those states, with the exception of Minnesota, all of those states are within 2 to 5% difference. So what does that tell you? That tells you that Native people probably made the difference. For one of the very first times in American history, Native peoples, Native American voters, and there's about 1.8 million, and from all intents and purposes, people are saying that there's a higher turnout this time around, probably one of the highest Native American turnouts of all time. Typically, there's around 2 million Native American votes out of potential 4. But let's just imagine for a moment that if 2% of those states, and in Arizona it's as high as 5%, so if the Native vote came out and it voted for Biden, that means Native people influenced the removal of the coup of the Bolivian government in their righteous election, where they voted in their indigenous president. And of course, you know, for a whole bunch of reasons, they went through acrimonious, and now they voted in another indigenous president, indigenous friendly president, vice president. And so anyways, so you can see Colombia, you can see in the Philippines, for example, you can see in right here in North America, Turtle Island. Indigenous peoples are always called ethnic conflicts all the time. But really what ethnic conflicts are, to cut through that image or that statement, ethnic conflicts, as Victoria Tolle-Corpez says, who is Indigenous rights activist, works for the United Nations and so on, says that ethnic conflicts in the world are really pitting Indigenous peoples asserting rights over territories against the global institutions that want to separate us from our land. That is most oftentimes what ethnic conflicts are. And there is perhaps no bigger ground zero for seeing what we often refer to as ethnic conflicts or indigenous-led conflicts or indigenous-led marches and peaceful invitations to those to join us in relationships on territories. Then right here I am right here. I've organized many of them here in Treaty 1 territory. I didn't organize this one, but I was a member of a group called I Don't Know More Winnipeg, who was a part of the leadership group that helped to assist and lead these organizations. Particularly, we made sure the security was possible, was Indigenous-led with Indigenous organizations and so on. And so this was a march that was about the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was a totem pole that was coming through our territory from the Lumbee, which was headed eventually to, if everybody remembers Standing Rock. So Standing Rock was what that issue was a number of years ago. Of course, that was an issue involving yet another situation, like many here in Canada, in which colonial governments, the United States and Canada, have used legal means, legislated means, oftentimes making up laws as they go, to steal Indigenous lands, steal most of them. In Canada, we have approximately 99% of Indigenous lands have been taken from Indigenous peoples, most of it forcibly, most of it illegally, illegally meaning they just made up the law in order to do so, and most of it involving theft, trickery, bribery, anything in other country that North American governments would call as corruption, they have done to Indigenous communities and Indigenous leadership, including my own community in 1907, where we were forcibly removed off the land by gunpoint in order that farmers may take our lands, and then they held a sham vote, which was a lie, and then eventually 100 years later, we went to the courts and we were compensated for that illegal and unjust removal. That happens all the time in Canada, all the time. And so in this situation, what we have is we have a consistent and continual need of state governments with corporate entities that are going after Indigenous lands for the final 1%. That's what is happening at the moment. Now, what this looks like is hammering through projects with almost little to no or ornamental consultation with those Indigenous communities, and Indigenous communities stand up and not perpetrate violence, even though what is happening to them is violent, but perpetrate peaceful invitation to all opening possibility, often celebratory marches, gatherings. What I would call this is a celebration of life, a celebration of partnership. What a treaty can actually look like. That's what these things look like. But we are often met with brutal state institutions at the order of legislative leaders, often in partnership with corporate entities, pushing themselves in violent ways against peacefully standing Indigenous peoples, most often on their own territories that has been recognized by the Supreme Court, also by traditional law, and yet our Indigenous peoples at the end of the day are forced off the land, forced to accept corporate development, even though they don't want it, things like fracking and pipelines and various other things. And the most brutal example of this is the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which you've probably heard a lot about here in Canada. Trans Mountain Pipeline is still a project that is ongoing and is probably manifested the best way we can see it is in another project that's similar to this, same company that owns it, with the Coastal GasLink pipeline with the Wet'suwet'en. And what happens is that the government now owns this pipeline. The federal government has bought this pipeline to the tune of $6 billion, which is it's paid to corporate entities. So that's called a partnership, by the way, and compensated them for that pipeline in order to be able to hammer that through. And then no doubt, once that pipeline's finished, they're going to sell it back to that private entity. Now, this is particularly the kind of example, the worst example, but it is an example that happens all the time. And did I mention that the Trans Mountain Pipeline is not only illegal in that it hasn't followed the consultation that its own government has imposed or that the Supreme Court has imposed, but it's also done it at the behest and the denial of Indigenous groups, some of who have signed on to those for benefit sharing agreements, but for the most part, most Indigenous communities have not, particularly from their traditional governance areas, because this is a non-treaty area. This is in which there are no treaties in operation. There's no legal agreements for Canada to even be there in the first place. So that now we have the situation of theft, more and more theft of Indigenous lands. Now you can check out on what that looks like. What it really looks like is the same thing that we see racism online, racism in forms of the media, for example. One of the biggest challenges that we have is within the media of not calling Indigenous peoples protesters, because frankly, they aren't protesting anything, they are protecting. And here's what they are doing. They're protecting their territories. They're protecting their rights. And oh, by the way, because they do those things, they also ensure clean water and air to breathe and land to live on for everybody. So in fact, Indigenous peoples are protecting everybody. I cannot say the same thing about LNG. I cannot say the same thing about Suncor or oil companies. I cannot say the same thing about anybody who builds a mine, because a mine not only pollutes the air, it also pollutes the groundwater, it also pollutes the earth itself and leaves a big devastating mess in the middle of places that the rest of us have to clean up, usually with radioactive or corrupt land. Or if you look at Yellowknife, for example, only approximately 15 miles from the city core of downtown Yellowknife is hundreds of tons of uranium taken from the land, which is simply just sitting in refrigerated boxes. If those refrigerated boxes ever turned off one day, all of Yellowknife would be dead. And the whole idea that this is happening on Indigenous territories is an abomination to everybody. And so the challenge is that we keep framing Indigenous peoples as problems. We keep saying, oh, they're the bane on the economy. They're the challenge to development. They're backwards and uncivilized. And this is within the very comments that you may have heard, which you'll hear people say, oh, well, Indigenous peoples are complaining and protesting, or why can't they just get over it? Or the thing that I most often hear is, why do I have to deal with these Indigenous peoples who are out protesting and demanding their rights to be honored? This isn't my fault. I wasn't there. My family has been here for one generation. We moved from whatever country. And my other favorite part of that conversation is usually, my people suffered in Poland, therefore everybody should suffer a little bit. You can get over it. Or my people suffered in Rwanda, or my people suffered in Russia, or whatever it might be. And that's just nonsense, because not only is that we're not here to play the genocide Olympics, but everybody's last place when we play that game. Everybody's last. There's no gold medals in the genocide Olympics. It's all everyone's last place. And so let's look instead at what Indigenous peoples are actually doing. And what we're actually doing is we're fighting a process in which for over 1,000 years, Indigenous lands have been forcibly taken and laws have been used to do it. So that means that we live in a system in which Indigenous peoples are consistently and continually treated as the enemies of the state, particularly when it comes to development. And then on top of that, we are not only treated as enemies of the states, we're forced to change. That's residential schools, that's controlling our movement and dress and speech. There was even a law in Canada in 1923 which banned letter writing by Indigenous peoples. We weren't allowed to write letters to complain about our treatment. And so that's crazy. You know, that's crazy that's where it's come to. And then particularly crazy when it comes to the situation involving just mass situations of poverty, gang violence, over-incarceration, which happens right here in Canada. In Canada, for example, 90% of the child welfare system in Manitoba, Indigenous, approximately 60% of the child welfare system nationally. If you look at the national federal incarceration, over half Indigenous peoples in the system, but yet we only make up 5% of the national population. If you look at the number of child poverty rates, you can see on this graphic right here, exponentially high, particularly on the prairies of Indigenous peoples. Murder missing Indigenous women and girls, tainted water, moldy houses, poverty on First Nation. I mean, I just keep going. My point of telling you is that none of that was choice. Nobody chooses to be poor. Nobody chooses to have diabetes. Nobody chooses to have their children suffering. That is Canada's intention. It has always been the intention, and it will continue to be the intention of Canada, because the poverty needs to be in place in order for Canada to control Indigenous peoples and to be able to hammer through and take that last 1%. And if that makes you uncomfortable, or if that makes anybody uncomfortable, that is unfortunately the truth. And the unfortunate truth to that is that it really doesn't matter how many prime ministers we have who say reconciliation. If nothing changes for the everyday life of Indigenous peoples, then frankly, I don't care how many boil water advisories that you lift. That's not reconciliation at all. That's called treating people like human beings. So the challenge that we have in front of us is, how do we begin to stand up to this? How do we change it? Well, I want to show you what Indigenous peoples are doing when we are met with violence. And this is the situation in a community called Elsipogtog, which is very similar to a situation that's right out in Nova Scotia right now, involving the lobster fishery. I could talk about that later if you want, about lobster fishery if you want, but this is Elsipogtog. And what happened is that shale gas was found on their territory, and New Brunswick wanted that shale gas. They were also with corporate entities partnered. And so what they did is they forced Indigenous peoples to accept fracking on a community called Elsipogtog. Now, Elsipogtog did not want fracking, because fracking destroys an ecology. It uses fresh water to spray into the earth on a diagonal drill. It also destroys all the ecology, destroys all of the animals, all of the beings that live within a territory. And then it particularly is a long-term impact that the rest of the community has to deal with, because it involves the expunging of those resources into the soil themselves, in which they're extracted. And then of course, what's left afterwards is nothing but waste. So community didn't want fracking. And so here we are, and I hope you guys are okay with a swear or two. Is that okay? Are you okay with that? There's a reason why I'm showing this video. And so I'll just show you a little bit about it, and just here we go. So this is the community when they were faced off with the police officers who were forcing them to move off their own land. And not only were they forced to be moved off their own land so that the corporate drilling can come through, but this is what happened in the community response.
They got turned down.
Okay, so what you can see here is an extremely divisive situation. You can see here police officers who have been sent in by the New Brunswick authorities in partnership with the corporation that wishes to frack, and they want to remove the people from the community. They've now pepper sprayed them. They're trying to force them off the lands, and there was a violent confrontation there. You probably heard a few swears and so on. And what happens is in about a minute from now, a police officer will brandish a weapon. And what they're going to do is he's going to pull out a weapon here. Right about here. And he's going to pull out his handgun, which is an automatic weapon. He's going to potentially fire into an unarmed crowd, which has no weapons. And I want you to see what one of our uncles has done. and then one of our aunties does after that. Okay, so very emotional situation. And what you can see there is our uncle offers his body to the community, which is what we do all the time as Indigenous peoples. We often think community first, individual second. And that is within our teachings themselves, within almost every song that we sing, with every story we tell, with every practice, traditional law that we have, we think, okay, what is best for the community here? And do we have to make a sacrifice for that? And that's what our uncle did in that moment. And you can actually see it again when his sister or partner or whoever she was came in front of him and then said, no, take me instead of him and the community. That's remarkable. That is remarkable that people would put their body on the line for what is a belief that the land is valuable, the earth is valuable, the water is valuable, the air is valuable. And not only is that important for both the community, but it's also going to save everybody in that territory as well, because water has this funny ability of traveling pollutants everywhere, so that everybody is going to get that pollutants from that fracking project, not just the people at LC Booktook. Now you can see here that police officers come in, cooler heads prevail, and then something really remarkable happens, because our uncle, who originally offered his body to everyone on behalf of the struggle, does something remarkable, and he teaches. And he does it right here. Now, if that doesn't give you hope, there's nothing that's going to. That just a second ago, our uncle offered his body to get shot on behalf of saving the very people that were shooting him. And now he's offering friendship. He's offering commitment. He's offering relationship. You know where you get that from? That's what you do when you offer tobacco. You're saying, I have offered this gift in this moment at this time of possibility of relationship, that we can be more than this. Let's put time into each other. But the uncle's not alone. If you go across the crowd, by the way, and you take a look what's happening on the other side of the crowd, something else really remarkable is happening. Check out over here at the exact same time. You know what that is right there? That is a grandmother smudging a guy with an AK-47. That is one fierce granny. That is one remarkable, remarkable, incredible woman believing in the power of the earth, doing exactly what you are doing here today as the Joint Ecological Ministry, which is talking about the power of our stories, talking about the power of belief and talking about the power of peace. Even in the face of genocidal violence, Indigenous peoples believe in the power of love. Those grandmothers are singing that song, inviting people with AK-47s into the potential of relationship. And if that isn't the proof that Indigenous peoples are invested in peace, conversation, and dialogue, oftentimes with state governments in partnership with corporations who are invested in nothing but stealing, violence, and murder, genocide, I don't know really what else to show you in that Indigenous peoples, we're really not against the economy. What we're probably against, if anything, is taking the last 1%. And what that means is that we are interested in there being water, earth, and sky for everybody. And particularly for our children, for that are there to come. That's why when I greeted you at the beginning, I said, Bonjour and Debwe Magadaduk, hello, my relatives. That's why when we're talking about our relationships, we're not actually talking about human beings. We're talking about our relationships with the non-humans. Our non-humans are those who carry our clans and our teachings of how we live in this place. So what we do is we turn to our clan relatives, which are the fish, the bears, the birds, the plants. We turn to our relatives and we say, what is it that we need to learn here? How do we learn to be sustainable? How do we learn to be in relationship in a productive, sustainable way with each other, in a mutually beneficial way, a reciprocal way with each other? And that's the way that we're going to make sure everybody has life. And yeah, we're going to face struggle. We're going to have floods. We're going to have challenges. There's nothing harder, by the way, than the winter. We're going to have to all face that together. How is it that we can come together to promote life and build life? Not just take one group of people, destroy them, make them work for everybody else, exploit them, put them into poverty, and then make sure that they stay in that poverty so they serve everyone else. There's that story at the beginning involving what's built the story of the American dream. But what we're going to do is we're trying to live in a reciprocal way, because Indigenous peoples are not protesters. I've never been to anything that we've protested. We are protecting. We protect our children, we protect our communities and our nations, we protect our laws and fundamentally who we are. And funny enough, when we do that, everybody benefits. We actually protect everybody as a response, because Indigenous values are based in a notion of collectivity. So in order for us to be protected, we also need others to be protected at the same time, because we want your children, we want your grandmothers and grandfathers and women and men and children to also be protected, because when you are protected, then we are protected too. And that's why all of us have to benefit on this together. And peace, love, and friendship based in things like legal agreements of treaties are not just kitschy little, funny little things that we say, oh, we're all, 1970s, true, love, not war, man. But love can change the world. And that kind of love in the face of genocidal violence, that peaceful, what we might describe as civil disobedience, but frankly is what I call is the most obedient of all to civility, is not often met with those who are invested in peace. But I truly believe that at the end of the day, that is what will win this struggle. And let me just show you quickly what I mean by that. This may just be a moot point, frankly, because Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing population. And not only the fastest growing population, we're growing to the tune of 42.5% on this side of the border. So that means in Canada, we're growing faster than anybody else. Now, problem, of course, is that not every second Indigenous person had a child in 10 years from 2006 to 2016. It's impossible to be that kind of population growth. But here's what it shows. It shows that, yes, do we have younger families? Yes, we're going to look at that in just a minute. But it's also safe for the first time ever to refer to yourself as Indigenous. Now, I'm not here to make a comment on that, to say that, but I will say this. You cannot just be Indigenous on a Friday. You can't just say, oh, well, I have blood, so therefore I'm Indigenous. That doesn't make you Indigenous. Blood does not make you Indigenous. Relationship makes you Indigenous. Blood gives you an opportunity for relationship. So that means that if you have blood, then you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity to connect with the community, with other Indigenous peoples. You also probably have access to Indigenous peoples. That means you have an access to a relationship. If you chop the wood, do the dishes, be kind, be responsible, then what's going to happen is Indigenous peoples are going to start referring to you as their own. And therefore, you are then part of families and communities and maybe ceremonies as well. And if you eventually earn that place in a relationship, just like you would earn citizenship of any nation, then eventually Indigenous peoples will call you their own, because it's not who you claim, it's about who claims you. So that means that this growth of Indigenous peoples can be somewhat problematic in that we see a lot of people claiming Métis identity, particularly in the East, where there isn't a lot of connections with the actual Métis nation. Here in Manitoba. So people in Quebec have a real problematic way of referring to themselves as Métis. I think what they're referring to themselves as mixed blood, which isn't a nation, by the way. So what they probably need to do is think about their connections with Indigenous peoples in that territory. It's not delegitimizing that claim, but saying that I question their claims of indigeneity when they're simply just talking about being mixed blood people. There's no culture to that. There's no ceremonies to that. There's no nation to that. So the actual Métis Nation itself lives in Manitoba, also parts of Saskatchewan, Alberta, a little bit of BC, a little bit of Ontario. That's the actual Métis Nation. So if you're part of that and you're connected to that, then you can call yourself Métis, and to people that refer to you as Métis. But that being said, so let's just take that number as a grain of salt, 42.5%. But what that means is Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing population. Why? Because the average age is between 5 and 19. And the average age of Canadians is between 35 and 59. So what's happening in Canada, and I know there's people who are not in Canada on this call, but what's happening in Canada is we see an exponential growth of Indigenous peoples in the younger age categories. And that means that most older Canadians, that is most of society, 95% of the population, is going to be facing a reality. And the reality is that in some segments of our economy, in some places, and if you look at the largest concentration of Indigenous peoples, you can see this in this red dot. So where is it? Of course, my territory, where I'm sitting right now, Treaty 1 territory, you see more Indigenous peoples entering into the mainstream, entering into the universities, nearly 10-12% of the University of Manitoba where I work. You're seeing more and more Indigenous peoples entering into the popular discourse and imagination within our community. We have nearly 20% of Manitoba self-declared Indigenous peoples. That means 1 in 5 Indigenous peoples are within here. Similar in Saskatchewan, we are leading the country in terms of proportional amounts, not considering the North, for example, where there are a lot higher Indigenous peoples, in fact, the majority. But if you look in terms of understanding what's happening within Manitoba and Saskatchewan, it's going to happen elsewhere. It just might take longer. That means in Southern Ontario, look at all the red dots down here. If you coalesce all those red dots, it's much bigger than Manitoba. In fact, there are more Indigenous peoples in Ontario than there are in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. In fact, if you combine Manitoba and Saskatchewan together, you about get Ontario's Indigenous population. Oh, Quebec, you too. You're almost 1.5 times the size of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So what I'm trying to say is that Manitoba or Ontario, Saskatchewan, you are coming. You are coming. But what's happening in Manitoba and Saskatchewan is happening first. So therefore, you can actually see your future, Ontario and Quebec and Alberta and British Columbia. You can see your future, what's happening in Manitoba. And what's happening in Manitoba is that the baby boomer generation is retiring, and Indigenous peoples are often filling in those positions. And if we don't prepare Indigenous peoples for the reality of filling in those positions, we're all going to be worse off as a community. We're all going to have to pay for it on some level. So if we continue this ongoing trend of the country of incarcerating, treating Indigenous peoples as problems, saying, oh, you're a bunch of protesters instead of protectors, treating Indigenous peoples as if they're somehow antithetical to the economy, which we are not. What we are is antithetical to death. Then what we're going to do is we're going to have a big problem in our economy. We're going to pay for it on one level. Do we want an economy that's going to be filled with competent, strong Indigenous peoples who will then pay taxes for everybody, care for the upper baby boomer generation, the elder baby boomer generation? Or are we going to have more and more people in jails, more and more people in the child welfare system, more and more people in the justice, health, education system who are continually having challenges for all of us? Well, we're going to have to pay for that because that's how the systems it works. And the bottom line of it is that if we don't make space, which is what we do at the University of Manitoba, we have to commit to Indigenous peoples, because at the end of the day, we will commit to everyone as a result. We will invest, by investing in Indigenous peoples, we invest in our own future, because those are the people who will be taking care of you, taking care of all of us, me too. I'm not part of that youth group, even though I know I look so young, but no, I'm not. So I'm 44. Now, one of the coolest things that happens when we make space is Indigenous peoples do remarkable, amazing, beautiful things. And they begin to teach us all about the importance of innovation and creativity. So these are some of my students right here. This is Nathan Legacy. He finished the first master's degree on Indigenous video games. Do you know how many people have a master's degree in Indigenous video games? 1, and you're looking at it in North America. Here's Angelina McLeod. She's talking about the theft of birch bark skulls from her community with the Glenbow Museum, really important project. Here's Jonathan Coachman writing the first Cree opera. Here's Ashley Richard talking about how do we create ethical corporate entities that can work with Indigenous peoples, not to exploit them, but to work with them in terms of co-ops, like Treaty. How do we help businesses, the private sector, build that relationship? Now, one of our students is called Braden Harper. Now, Braden Harper learned about all the things that I talked to you about today, which is about treaty people. How do we build sustainable economies, sustainable worlds in which everybody benefits and not one side is exploited and one side is not? Well, he got a job working for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, which, for those of you that don't know, is a football team here in Canada. Pretty big deal out in our territory here, and it works in the Canadian Football League. And the thing about football is a story about land theft. Just watch football if you know what I mean. Football is how much land you're rewarded, how you win the game of football is how much land you steal from someone else through violence, not through kindness, not through negotiation. It's through trickery, through theft, and through violence. That's how you win football. So football is like a story. In fact, it's the story of North America. That is the story. That's why Indigenous logos are so powerful and important in football, and why you don't honor Native people through land theft, because Native people have never stolen any land whatsoever. They've had land stolen from them. So in fact, football is one big trigger. But, you know, Braden starts working for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and what he says is, hey, Winnipeg Blue Bombers, a professional football team, why don't we talk about treaty before the game, in which we're going to trigger everyone in the community and remind them about genocide and land theft. That we remind our community that that before the game we're relatives, we're treaty people, and then after the game we're going to be treaty people. So let's say that before the game. And the Bombers say, that's a great idea. So they began to do it, and they do it, and they say it before every game now. Well, it turns out there's another team in the city, a professional hockey team called the Winnipeg Jets, as well as another team called the Edmonton Oilers, and they look to what the Blue Bombers are doing. They say, that's a great idea. We want to do that. And I wrote the acknowledgement that the Winnipeg Jets say before every game. And that's what happens. But then the Jets didn't stop there, because the Jets said, well, if we're going to be recognizing treaty, we better do something about that, because it's not about just a gift. Remember with tobacco? When somebody offers you something, you're expected to do something with it. You're expected to spend that 100 hours back committing to that relationship. So here's what the Jets did.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm LMTS Place welcome to the Strong Warrior Girls Anishinaabe singers, who will perform our national anthem in Ojibwe.
And the Jets didn't just do that. And by the way, let's just think for a moment that Indigenous languages were banned until 30 years ago in schools. And those are young women learning the language. Yes, they're speaking O Canada. I don't really care what they're singing, frankly, but they're singing in Ojibwe for 15,000 people who applauded them. Not just that, but when you heard that little part of the song, there's a little tradition we have in Winnipeg where we come to the part in O Canada where we say True North. Everybody says True North, and it has to do with honoring the people who brought the Jets back to Winnipeg. They're called True North. Anyways, so a local radio station in town taught everybody in Winnipeg to say Gi-Wei-Tun, which means north wind. And so at that part of the song, you heard everybody say Gi-Wei-Tun, which is pretty darn remarkable. Now, at that exact same night, Big Drum opened the game. We had Indian throat singers. We also had Métis jiggers who sang and played at the intermission. And the Jets also indigenized their logo. And they, for the warm-up, the NHL wouldn't let them wear it for the game. The team wanted to wear it for the game. but they wore it for the warm-up, and then they sold those jerseys for benefiting for Indigenous youth. The Jets also fund 7 Indigenous hockey teams in the city. They also support Indigenous communities with mental health, and they also fly Indigenous communities down to watch games. You know what that's called? It's called sharing space. That's what being a treaty person is all about. And that's just a small example, and it doesn't change the world. It doesn't change much. It certainly doesn't change tainted water. It certainly doesn't change murder missing Indigenous women and girls. It certainly doesn't change the ongoing genocide that Indigenous communities are experiencing. But you know what it does? It shows people reality. It doesn't shy away from the truth of who we fundamentally are as people in Treaty 1 territory. And it's people who are taking an active role, who certainly are not experts. The owner of the Winnipeg Jets is a good friend of mine named Mark Chipman. And he's not an expert in any means on treaty, but here's what he is he says, I want to give everyone in our community a vision of what it means to be a Winnipegger. And so making space means that everybody benefits. And if that means 15,000 people, some of whom I'm sure had no idea about what Indigenous peoples do, say, think, or do, it showed a positive image of what Indigenous peoples contribute to our community. And it showed an image of not protesters, but protectors and people who are benefiting and building our community alongside one another. And it's what we do all the time. It's why we build urban reserves here in Winnipeg. It's why we are the investment of this city. We are building multi-billion-dollar developments across the city where Walmart comes in, steals all of our profits, all of our money, sends it to wherever else in corporate entities, and then across the United States or Canada or wherever, Costco, IKEA, when they come here, they take all the money, they send it elsewhere, and then when they can't make enough money, they just leave it. They just leave. Indigenous peoples, they bring billions of dollars of investment into the city and then invest it here. They do it all. And most importantly is that, there is nothing that's more building a community than investments in Indigenous peoples. By making space for Indigenous peoples, everybody benefits as a result. And that's what the Winnipeg Jets were trying to do by building that. So I'm probably going to be asked the inevitable question at the end of this, which is, what can I do? Well, I hope that I've given you some methods in which you can understand. First is, I gave you a way in which you can understand traditional ways of operating, which is through things like tobacco. And then the second thing that I did is I gave you an idea of what Indigenous peoples are offering and engaging in different spaces. And what are we doing in different spaces? Well, we're offering opportunities of peace and friendship and kindness and love, often in the face of genocidal violence. We do the same thing in terms of operating on the world stage in the United Nations. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is one big document about love. How do we love each other? It is not a document about limiting anything, and it's certainly not what the 35% of Canada believes and maintains this horrible lie that the United Nations Declaration is some kind of veto. It's not a veto at all. It's called partnership, it's called family, it's called treaty. That's how we live together. Nobody's against anything. What people are against, if anything, is exploitation, violence, and murder. That's what we're against. And so let's look to get each other and see each other as the possibility of community. What I hope I gave to you at the end is examples of what people are doing in small ways, but those small ways change the world. They change the conversation. Even the Winnipeg Jets, who are a sports franchise, multi-million-dollar sports franchise, who, for all intents and purposes, didn't have to do anything, the things that they did, but yet they are changing the conversation here in Manitoba and Treaty 1 territory. And you too can do that. You can do it in a coffee shop. You can do it around a kitchen table. You can do it at the voting booth. You can do it in all the different ways. So with that, I say a huge miigwech and thank you for your time and for giving me a little bit of space in your conversation for today. I think there's some time for conversation or comments or questions. So go right ahead. I'll hand it back over to the organizers here. So,
towards the end of your talk, you talked about UNDRIP, or the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada is supposed to be nearly ready to pass. But what needs to be in federal legislation that can make the values contained within that document a reality, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all of us, so that together we become a better nation?
Yeah, the challenge is that Canada is not built on any facet of Indigenous rights. So to be able to bring Indigenous rights in at the back door is going to be very stressful and very difficult. And it's going to involve a lot of what we think are changes but are not, because pre-existing, the way law works is on precedent. So it's like trying to recognize Indigenous land claims when every single land claim has been ignored for the first 150 years of a country. It takes a lot of undoing and a lot of, like for instance, you can't go back and change the popple bulls on Jacques Cartier's ships, but yet that was the preeminent feature of the basis for Canadian law, which is that when Europeans set foot on something, they immediately owned it. And so that's the problem, in that that's the basis for Canadian law. So how do you then engage that and say, well, Indigenous rights are supposed to fit into that model? How do you fit in a model that's racist? Like,
Yeah.
so there's a real challenge there. So that, I'd say the same thing with the United Nations Declaration. The problem is that the Indian Act, as the way it stands today, is going to always undermine and supersede anything that has to do with anything Indigenous. So the problem is that every time you have a Supreme Court decision that recognizes Indigenous rights, it has to fit within the existing boundary of the Indian Act and the way the Indian Act has impacted Canadian law. So you're constantly in a situation of ornamental, very small incremental changes. That's an example of what the moderate livelihood is defined by the Marshall decision, which impacts the lobster fishermen. So that means you're only in a situation where all you can ever do is fish lobster to basically a poverty level, and basically just a barely livable amount called moderate living. And that's because the Indian Act ensures that Indigenous rights or Indigenous claims are also always superseded by Canadian economic interests. So there's a whole bunch of things around that of how do we engage, but the issue is replacing the Indian Act is the challenge. You can't just remove it, because it would be like trying to remove the foundation of a house. The whole house would collapse. So what you have to do is you have to replace it. And just like you do with any faulty house, you have to replace, and then what you do is you start building on the blocks of that foundation. So the new Indigenous rights legislation is a hopeful trend, I think, that the federal government was interested in doing. The problem, of course, is that trying to hammer 642 nations into one set of rights is never going to work. I would like to see anyone try to get Europe nations to agree. I try to get all of Europe to agree on anything. It's like trying to get Indigenous nations to agree, 643 of them, on anything. So that means that probably what you want to do is invest yourself in the process of looking at what the Royal Commission offered you, Royal Commission on Aboriginal People 1996, which is to get Indigenous peoples to operate within government, probably as their own parliament, in collaboration with the existing parliament. Oh, this is a solution, by the way, that would remove the useless and totally nepotistic and corrupt Senate. And my dad's a senator, so I'm the first to say that. And then the second is that we need to put Indigenous peoples in government. That would deal with the issue of consultation, also the issue of commitment to Indigenous peoples, and then get Indigenous nations to self-define themselves, not according to their individual First Nations, which is never how we've self-defined, but according to the groupings in which they choose to define themselves. And then therefore Canada can deal with those nations, like for instance, the Anishinaabe or Treaty 1 First Nations. However we choose to define ourselves, that's how we will define ourselves.
Okay.
So then rights can be established then.
Yeah, a huge amount of work, but worthwhile.
I almost see it as very simple, but yet,
okay.
Yeah, does it take time and commitment? Yeah, but apparently we can put people on the moon.
Good point. Thank you.
Oh, and by the way, you know, like everybody's saying, oh, this is going to cost so much money. Well, apparently when there's a national emergency put into play, we can find hundreds of billions of dollars in about a week.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, when we decide something's important, we can do it. But when Native people are a part of it, then it's not important, right?
Okay, well, connected with that is a point on you made in your presentation about Indigenous people taking on leadership roles. What do you see as critical, especially with those big corporations that they'll have to deal with around land rights, resources, water, you know, I could go down the list. What is critical in trying to build relationships at that level?
Yeah, I think it's, like I said before, Indigenous peoples are not anti-economy. Like, we are not anti, you know, blow up the system. Like, nobody believes in getting a time machine and going back in time. What Indigenous peoples are always invested in is what is based within our locality, how do we operate within this space, and how do we operate sustainably elsewhere so that the world can be a place in which life is bountiful everywhere, not just for us, that is bountiful for everyone involved. Well, so I think working in the corporate world is a good example. I think it's critically important that people in the corporate world work with competent Indigenous peoples, not peoples who are looking for a job or are looking to help exploit Indigenous communities. And frankly, there are lots of Indigenous peoples who, because of poverty and a number of other instances, have disjointed relationships with communities, and frankly are some of the worst genocidal colonial people of all, are people within our own communities. But frankly, the bottom line of it is we want competent Indigenous peoples who are working within entities to support the development and the engagement of ethical relationships with those communities. And then also on the basis of trying to get us all to move away from an exploitative economy into a sustainable economy, whatever that looks like. And does that mean that I'm anti-oil? No, I wouldn't say that's part of an anti-oil agenda. I would say a responsible ethical use of resources is important. I think we're already well past the point where more oil projects will just seek to destroy us. So maybe we scale that back. Maybe we look at the ways we can ethically produce certain energy, but we also shore up the creation of other energy that is sustainable. And frankly, we don't need more pipelines. We don't need more. Fracking projects. We don't need more oil sands creation. We don't need more mines. What we need is more innovative ways in which we can engage the world in sustainable and ethical ways, so that we can all live, and that we aren't in the situation of constantly fighting over land or exploiting land or stealing land. What we are is in the position of everybody benefiting with each other in an economy that's sustainable. And then maybe we actually start sharing some resources. We stop producing money in a 1% that is only invested in stealing and taking, you know, everything from elections to more and more profit to, you know, hiring their own family. Oh, who am I talking about? Like I said, Donald Trump's not the problem. Donald Trump is a symptom.
So how would you define the problem?
The problem is that we celebrate capitalism, private ownership, and neoliberalism. Okay. And the sooner that we can realize that that is a perfect way to kill ourselves, then the sooner that we can begin to engage ethical resources and ethical resource management, ethical commitments to one another. And frankly, you know, like, there are places in the world that are hell-bent on destroying all of us. But, you know, I believe in the goodness of humanity. I have to, because I have a child who is so good, is such a good human being. And, you know, all of her friends, good human beings, come from different walks of life, speak different languages. But, you know, I thoroughly believe in the goodness of humanity. And I hope you do too. Isn't that the whole reason we're here in the first place? Yes, exactly. Isn't that what the Bible's all about?
Yes. We often lose sight of that. Anyway, there's another question that came in dealing with residential schools, and we know that that has implications for those of us who are part of faith communities. Some of our communities participated in running them. So what's some of the elements of a reconciling way forward that you could offer for us to consider, to think about, to try to move forward, if there is anything?
Well, the problem with Christianity is not Christianity, it's the Christians. And I say that with all love and respect for Christianity. Having grown up in the United Church, I have a deep affinity for the David Fielder, who was my minister for a number of years. I'm not a Christian in any way. but I do have a deep affinity and respect for Christianity, including my grandmother, who is a devout Catholic. And when she died, she asked to be buried in a Catholic way, and we all respected that and honored that in the way in which she wished to do that. The problem, of course, is that when Christians tell me that it's those Christians over there, it's just a cop-out. Like, I've never heard a bigger cop-out in my life than Christians going, well, Christianity is not uniform, and there's different ways of Christianity. I say, if you are Christian and you see another Christian being violent, then I go, there's your task, there's your work. I mean, the whole idea is, it seems to me that the Bible is supposed to be about love. It's supposed to be about inclusive. It's supposed to be about respecting those who have different opinions and seeing that we all come together. I think of the stories of Jesus taking care of the poor. I'm thinking of the stories of Jesus listening to the stones singing. I'm thinking of the stories of all the beauty of love and commitment and how it can change the world through faith and belief. And what I see is, I often see Christians acting in ways that are worse than some of the most genocidal maniacs, because they support regimes and they support positions and other Christians who are of positions of missionization and destruction and when I say the biggest violence in our communities that have been perpetrated has been based on the notion that we have to somehow change to reconcile ourselves with Christianity, where there is nothing more Anishinaabe than everything I just said: love, inclusivity, ethics, responsibility, commitment to the earth. But yet Christians have somehow mutated in some way, and I'm not saying every Christian, I'm saying Christianity itself has mutated into this political vehicle of somehow thinking that there is a separation to land, that there's a separation to politics and government, or that there's a separation from ethics. And that there's a real problem in mission projects that seek to change people. And it's not only that, but it's violent. And the idea that that's in any way a biblical teaching, I think, is not only a misreading of the Bible, but is also thoroughly violent, in which the Bible wasn't intended to be, if you believe in the Bible. And so the challenge, I think, is that when we look at residential schools as an example, the legacies of residential schools continue. So residential schools are over, but the legacies we're in full effect. You only have to look in downtown Winnipeg. Who are the 90% of street people? Those are residential school survivors or intergenerational impacts. I myself am a residential school intergenerational person who has been impacted by the legacies. That means that I have alcoholism, addiction, I have shame, I have anger, I have all of those things inside of me. And just because I have a university degree doesn't mean that I have the same struggles as people on the streets. But luckily, I've had enough people within my own life, some non-Native people, many Native people, who have helped me to find a way and a path through a lot of those challenges and carry that trauma in a lighter way than some of my relatives on the streets. So our job is to help other people where the impacts of those churches have been. One of the luckiest things I've ever had in my life was a wonderful minister who's named David Fielder, also a professor named Gordon Johnson, both devout Christians, both devoutly committed to the church and to the beliefs of the Bible, but both are the most ethical people who have taught me about being Anishinaabe in profound, beautiful ways. And that says to me, what they did is they took a real study, a hardcore study of what means Anishinaabe, what means Christian, and realized that those things are in concert. Those things join together. And to be Anishinaabe means that you can bring an understanding to Christianity that helps even Christianity, that helps build Christianity. And so residential school survivors, I think, have a historical mistrust surrounding the church, completely understandable. I think, in fact, that the Catholic Pope has never recognized the genocide of residential schools, makes that Catholics have no leg to stand on in Indigenous communities. There's your work, Catholics. I don't think you have any leg to stand on in any Indigenous communities until the leadership of your own church determines that the violent genocide that you've perpetrated has to be recognized and affirmed, and then maybe you can begin to move forward. I don't care how many archbishops do it. Frankly, that's your work. And I say that with absolute love for the Catholic Church, but frankly, you don't have a leg to stand on. No wonder people are turning away from you. Same thing with Anglicans, same thing with the United Church, same thing with Methodism, all people who ran residential schools. If you don't commit to a different way of behaving, and committing yourself to relationships. And frankly, I say this kind of sounding very harsh, but I've seen more change and beauty in Catholic, Anglican, like one of my best friends is Chris Trott, who is the Anglican minister at St. John's College in the University of Manitoba. He speaks profound, he speaks fluent Inuktitut. He's worked with Indigenous communities, Inuit communities. He works his butt off to make sure that Indigenous people can succeed in universities. He's been a colleague and a friend of mine. I mean, remarkable, wonderful person who has reconciled those positions and works very hard to help the Anglican Church to reconcile itself in all of its work. And the problem, of course, is that the same principles that went into building residential schools are still in those churches. So that means the work is still there. And I say that meaning tasking you, calling you to action to do it, but at the same point, helping your churches to become productive members of communities, walking with us, not walking for us, helping us ally to build, warm clothing and safe communities, help us deal with this horrible epidemic of poverty and sickness and diabetes in our communities, help us at the voting booth to be able to employ and put political leaders in charge that are competent on Indigenous issues and that aren't a bunch of puppets who say nonsense and frankly have no understanding of the United Nations Declaration or the Indian Act or what it takes to build communities. And I think there's a real problem with Christianity and right-wing positions that think that morality come together, but Indigenous peoples are most often tossed out in that regard because we are not white Christians. We don't come from those positions that I think Christianity thinks of itself as valuing. By the way, I think that's often hypocritical from the right wing and the Christian beliefs, but anyways, that's another conversation for another day. Indigenous peoples don't come from those traditions. So, hey, let's be inclusive. That's what the Bible's supposed to be all about. Let's look at the ways Indigenous families operate and say to ourselves, that might also be in concert with Christianity too.
Thank you. I think we all recognize that our own understanding of being Christian is really very limited, and there's much more that we can learn sometimes by exposing ourselves to the insights and the ways other groups live and express their faith, including Indigenous people. So,
well, I just want to applaud this group. One thing I love is interfaith and joint interfaith groups who are willing to do the brave work of talking amongst Christians of what does that mean? What are ways that we can share those positions? Because I think that needs to happen way more.
I think many of us on this call would agree with that as well. So it's almost 10 to 3, or 10 to 4 rather, excuse me. And I'm just going to throw out one. If anybody has one more question, if not, we'll...
I see someone named Richard Palmaville has their hand up. I'm not sure who that's. Okay. He's an attendee, but.
Okay, Richard, can you? I don't have all the full gallery. Okay, so can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I see. Okay,
I think. Yeah. There you go, Richard. You're on.
Yeah, so maybe one of the interesting aspects of all the treaties, I mean, obviously at the beginning, we talked about the acknowledgement, we talked about the treaties. You did mention the Indian Act, and obviously there's a lot of people who are saying that the Indian Act is the source of a lot of the issues, and there's a certain judge that you may know who basically, as part of the TRC, had said that it was education who got us into this trouble, and education's going to get us out of that. I'm just wondering, any recommendation on you think that we should be doing from a general education? Obviously, we talked about the Christian group like here today as a step. Any other recommendations in terms of activities you would recommend? So,
well, so you're talking about in terms of education?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is my bread and butter because I'm a former educator, grade 9 teacher, I taught at Calvin High School here in Winnipeg, about 8 blocks from where I live now. So I've written two major curriculums, one with the Assembly of First Nations, another one with the Inspire, the National Indigenous Education Group. They're both available. They're both curriculums online. Just type in my name and then type in curriculum, and then you'll see those. But there's some really excellent stuff that comes out of BC, which is with the First Nations, I believe it's First Nations Educational Institute around residential school curriculum, which is really great. We also have some really great stuff happening along the prairies. I think in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, I'm a little biased, of course, but we come up with some of the most innovative curriculums because we've been at it much longer than everybody else. I think Indigenous education started here in the 1970s, where most places elsewhere it starts in the 80s and 90s. So because we've been doing it since the 70s, there's really great curriculums online that are available here in Manitoba. So you can look up, you know, the provincial Indigenous education directorate. It's called Indigenous Education Directorate with the province of Manitoba. They have really great stuff online available for anyone. There's also really great stuff that's available through a publisher called Highwater Press here in Winnipeg. Highwater Press publishes some private stuff, but they also they publish free teachers guides online. I've written one of them, so you can check them out as well. There's some really great stuff there. But there's really great stuff everywhere. There's some really great stuff being done in Ontario with the First Nations, what's it called again? First Nations Education, FNEIAO, First Nations Educators. Anyways, they put curriculums online, FNIEAO. And I know that's their acronym, so you can look them up. Jody, her name is Jody Williams, who's in charge of that organization. I've spoken at their organization as a keynote a couple times, but they put curriculums online. They're really fantastic.
Okay. Thank you so much, Niigaan, for your time, your insight, your experience, and your wisdom, which you shared so generously with us this afternoon.
Well, thank you for your time.